1977, a triumphant year in screen history. On May 25th, at the world-famous Chinese Theater in Hollywood, California.
Star Wars.
The Empire Strikes Back.
George Lucas. Return of the Jedi.
George Lucas's brainchild from the late 1970s to early 2000s, the series is a timeless work of science fiction fantasy, a sprawling epic that combines the operatic nature of Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and the heightened action of early morning TV serials. But what if I told you Star Wars was something more, something deeper? Were you aware that Star Wars was about Vietnam? Did you know Star Wars is actually about Vietnam? Star Wars is actually about Vietnam. Okay, I understand how crazy that sounds.
We will have to do some scanning, figure out what Vietnam actually is.
You mean to tell me that this was inspired by a foreign conflict fought between North and South Vietnam, facilitated by the United States government to prevent the spread of communism during the 50s, 60s, and 70s? But yes, actually, it was. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that George Lucas has made other films other than Star Wars. Before ever picking up a camera for his space adventure epic, Lucas served as the director for 2 other films. Those 2 projects, THX 1138 and American Graffiti, were made partially in collaboration with The Godfather director, Francis Ford Coppola. Produced under Lucas and Coppola's joint production company, American Zoetrope, these movies at first seemed nothing alike. A story of dystopian descent and a coming-of-age flick were far from a cohesive thematic duology. What these films did reveal, however, was the political nature of Lucas's filmmaking. THX was a story of government oversight, technological danger, and resistance. American Graffiti was, well, a movie about cars? No, it was a movie about the time before Vietnam, a time of innocence. Listen, I get it. It sounds like I'm grasping at strings here, but just hear me out. Working with Coppola, Graffiti was intended to be the first in a spiritual trilogy of films. In Chris Taylor's How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, it was described as movies about the war in 3 modes: past, present, and future, absence, reality, and allegory. So you're probably noticing that there's 2 roles left open, right? And Lucas only made Star Wars after Graffiti. Well, yeah, but Lucas also worked on one of Vietnam's most acclaimed representations in film. Coppola's 1979 Academy Award-winning film was originally Lucas's project. Intended to document the present state of the war, it was a brutal, realistic representation of American involvement. When Lucas failed to finalize a draft, he placed it on the back burner until Coppola picked it up and directed the resulting Apocalypse Now. Now that we understand Lucas's previously politically charged production experience, we can go back to Star Wars.
Star Wars. It is more than just a successful movie, it is a box office phenomenon.
Released in 1977, Star Wars was an instant hit. It almost goes without saying that the film opened to raving audiences in a goldmine of cash.
The film is breaking attendance records all over the country.
Earning $187 million in its first 6 months, it quickly dethroned Spielberg's Jaws as top-grossing blockbuster and assumed its rightly deserved position as highest-grossing film of the time. Thing is, critics hated it. Entire review columns dismissed Lucas's passion project as child's fare, mindless schlock that was only entertaining without a critical perspective and lacked any deeper meaning beyond what was on screen.
The movie is pure escapism, no big social message.
It's old-fashioned, escapist entertainment, pure and simple, with no moral, no message.
Intended to be the third in Lucas's trilogy of Vietnam films, this couldn't be further from the truth. With war in the name, Star Wars was never a secret war film. Much of Lucas's concept work on his earlier versions of Apocalypse Now were even reworked to fit his new story. In an interview, he said, "I would essentially deal with some of the same interesting concepts that I was going to use and convert them into a space fantasy, so you'd have essentially a large technological empire going after a small group of freedom fighters or human beings." Even in regards to Coppola's Apocalypse Now, its nature as anti-war, anti-Vietnam remained true to Lucas's original intentions. Development of those concepts into a space opera created the war commentary precedent in 1977 Star Wars. As early as Lucas's original notes for the film, he was far from subtle in its allegorical resemblance to Vietnam. A small, independent country like North Vietnam instigated by gangsters aided by Empire. Although this is obviously far from the Tatooine, Alderaan, and Rebel fleet that we got in the final product, Lucas's intention to create a big-screen cinematic allegory for American involvement in Vietnam was clearly present. Countless elements of the film were developed to mirror and reference real-world aspects of the war against communism. For one, the Empire's Death Star, a battle station and weapon of immense, unstoppable power, was inferred to reference the atomic bomb. Moff Tarkin, the commander of the station, is obsessed with demonstrations of power and violence to subdue the population. This Tarkin doctrine mirrored American justification for the Manhattan Project, a supreme weapon used to instill fear until surrender and ultimate peace. Despite only being used to end World War II, the atomic arms race between the collective communist nations and the United States was indicative of high tensions in the time of war. This period of conflict in Vietnam induced the draft. Lucas himself was nearly forced into military service, but avoided it due to a surprise diagnosis of diabetes. The draft was a real-world call to action, one that prohibited refusal. Within the film, it was a narrative opportunity to highlight the difference between the liberty of the freedom fighters and the relentless, oppressive nature of the Empire. Luke had the freedom to refuse service, but soon realized its necessity after the murder of his aunt and uncle by Imperial troops. The morality of his joining in arms differs heavily from the forced draft. There is virtue in joining a righteous personal defense. In contrast to this righteous cause, the Empire was explicitly intended to be depicted as fascist. Lucas used Nazi iconography, terms, and scenes reminiscent of World War II to create a distinct image of war, violence, and tyranny. By tying these images to the Empire, he also tied them to the United States, labeling them as fascist for their involvement in Vietnam. Among the most famous scenes in the Star Wars saga, the Empire Strikes Back Battle in the Snow on Hoth features intense trench warfare indicative of the World Wars era. In this scene, we see the introduction of the all-terrain armored transport, the AT-AT Walker. So you see this bad boy right here? One of those things, AT-M6, but the original AT-AT. So this thing up here was based off of the cybernetic anthropomorphous machine.
The quadruped was developed for the United States Army as an experimental vehicle for rough terrain.
Which was commissioned by the American government for GE to produce for use in Vietnam. The harsh landscape of Hoth 2 was speculated to reference the unforgiving nature of the Vietnamese forests. I'm personally more partial to Return of the Jedi's forest moon of Endor, given Lucas's direct accreditation of the Ewoks to the Viet Cong after production. The Emperor 2 had origins in real-world Vietnam politics. Lucas wasn't exactly subtle in referencing Nixon as an inspiration for his character. So, Star Wars is pretty political. Perhaps as a result of this political relevance, the film is unsurprisingly present throughout real-world politics. When President Ronald Reagan proposed a new space-oriented Cold War policy,
a space-age system designed to neutralize an enemy nuclear missile attack,
a congressman labeled it as nothing more than nonsense stripped straight from Star Wars.
A system domestic critics today called too high cost, too high tech, too pie in the sky.
Later in Reagan's presidency, the film was also referenced in a presidential speech, labeling the Soviet Union as an evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
Obviously, this was not taken lightly, and he received copious backlash, forced to rescind his statements and deny any connection to the films. Okay, so basically, Star Wars is about Vietnam. So Star Wars being political wasn't something that only applied to the old movies. So the newer Disney Star Wars movies like The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens, people say that they're way too political, and that's basically where I found out about the original Star Wars films being based on Vietnam. And I think it's really interesting how people don't realize that, and I find it really cool to be able to get deeper into that, understand that better, and I was able to do so by reading Chris Taylor's How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, which kind of gives a whole background on the series, and George Lucas and all that. So if you want to learn more about Star Wars and more about the history of Star Wars, go ahead and read this book. And of course, in order to get more information on the movies themselves, what better resource? Hello.
Hi. What?